Welcome back to the Friday Show, presented by the Jockey Club. August 3 is the date for the Jockey Club Roundtable Conference. This week they announced some of the speakers and the agenda for it. Keynoting is going to be Michael Lopez, the Senior Director of Data and Analytics for the NFL. He's going to discuss how data is analyzed to enhance and help better understand football and possible correlations with horse racing. It's going to be a panel also with Pat Cummings from the Thoroughbred Idea Foundation to look into computer-assisted wagering, which is a big topic these days, and all sorts of other stuff. Jockey Club Roundtable is always an interesting event. I'm Ray Paulick, joined this week by news editor Chelsea Hackbarth. Joe Nevels is on vacation for the week. Welcome to the Friday Show, Chelsea. Good to see you.
Happy to fill in for Joe, just not full time.
You know, we usually have a guest on the Friday Show, and this week with the big news of Churchill Downs extending Bob Baffert's banishment from all of its facilities, all the Churchill-owned facilities, for another 18 months, because it's the rest of this year, I guess, and calendar year 2024. We thought we would talk about this, and I reached out to Bob Baffert and to his attorney to see if we could get Mr. Baffert to come on the Friday Show and discuss it, and we did not receive an affirmative response from either. So Chelsea and I talked about this a little bit before. We thought we would sort of present the questions that we would ask Bob Baffert if he was on the show. So Chelsea, the floor is yours. What would you ask Bob Baffert about his the reaction to this extension, which I was a little surprised by it. I don't know about you.
Really? You were? I was not surprised in the least.
That they extended the ban another year?
No.
Really? Okay.
No, Churchill's been one of the most outspoken anti-Bob in entities. So for them to extend the ban, especially when he continues to say the same thing over and over again and refuses to acknowledge that he's been legally proven incorrect, I can't say I blame them.
I just kind of figured when the time was up, it's up. But I put something on our patron page, the reader support page, suggesting that maybe Bill Carstanjen, the CEO of Churchill Downs, doesn't want Bob Baffert at the 150th Kentucky Derby next year. It's going to be a big celebration. This is going to be a shining moment for Churchill Downs and for Mr. Carstanjen himself. And I would have a hard time visualizing the two of them on the victory stand together if Bob was able to participate, and he did happen to win. It would be his, seventh Kentucky Derby, which would put him ahead of Ben Jones as the winningest Kentucky Derby trainer of all time. He had that record for a few months when Medina Spirit won and was subsequently disqualified, which is what led to this whole mess. Do you think the 150th Derby has anything to do with it?
Well, how can it not? I mean, they're going to put on a gigantic show, and why would they want anything in any way negative to be a part of that?
Yeah, and that's my thought too. Well, anyway, so you're not surprised. I am surprised, frankly. But what would you? So we got Bob on the show. What would you want to ask him?
Well, there were some interesting points that the administrative law judge who ruled on the case of Bob versus the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission brought up. So one of them was that Bob's attorney is the one who said that the Automax, the rash cream, is a permissible use of betamethasone. Nothing in the rules either agrees or disagrees with that necessarily. But the administrative law judge decided that the regulations prohibit betamethasone regardless of the method of administration. So why is he still arguing this?
Yeah, he also, the ALJ also wrote the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission's betamethasone regulations are clear. It's not like there's uncertainty there.
Clear as mud they are, yes.
Well, they're clear to the administrative law judge. I guess they're not as clear to the Baffert camp that the administration could have come from Otomax, the ointment containing betamethasone that they used to treat a skin rash on Medina Spirit, but the ALJ is saying it doesn't really matter, and that's been the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission's contention all along, that it doesn't matter. And furthermore, I think the ALJ wrote that their proof that came via George Malin, who was a witness for them, he runs the lab in New York, that his testing was not peer reviewed, that the methodology was not peer reviewed, and the ALJ really raised questions about whether or not their so-called proof was valid, that it was that kind of administration.
It does take time to get peer reviews in, and I understand that's why Dr. Malin was not releasing the full results of his study so that he could eventually publish it. But it sure doesn't look ideal for the Bob camp in this case.
So there were a couple other things in that administrative law judge recommendation to the Racing Commission that I found really interesting, and one of them had to do with, if you go way back to May of 2020, during the pandemic, when all of the races were kind of run out of order and stuff, on Arkansas Derby Day, which was, I think, the first Saturday in May, there were 2 positive tests for Baffert runners that day. One was Charlatan in the Arkansas Derby, and the other was Gamine in an allowance race. Both tested positive for lidocaine. And part of the suspension and part of Churchill Downs' actions was based on not just this one test that Medina Spirit had, but multiple positive tests. And so Charlatan and Gamine were both disqualified for their wins. They were appealed, and the Arkansas Racing Commission overturned the disqualifications, apparently buying into the story that the assistant for Bob Baffert, Jimmy Barnes, was wearing a lidocaine patch, a Salon Pas patch, when he saddled the horses that day. And apparently it was a hot day. He was adjusting the patch and somehow contaminated both horses with lidocaine. And in this report, the administrative law judge said that at the hearing, quote, at the hearing in this case, Mr. Baffert renounced this position, the position being that it was contamination. So I would ask, because I really am just curious, how did these horses end up with lidocaine if it wasn't from a patch? That was
lidocaine was used in blocking for lameness exams, and it can also be used in multiple other ways.
Yeah.
It certainly also does exist in the Salon Paw patch, and Jimmy Barnes was seriously injured 5 or 6 years ago now when a pony reared up and flipped over and crushed his pelvis. Mm-hmm. So there's no reason to not believe that story, but for Baffert to then turn around and say, never mind, that's not what happened.
Yeah.
What did happen?
Yeah. I'm curious how did that story change, and where did they? I mean, I guess once they got the victories reinstated and his suspension was reversed, he did have to pay a fine. So there was
like a $10,000 fine total.
It's still a violation, quotes around it, but there was no disqualification, no suspension. I guess once they got that worked out, it didn't really matter. But I think facts matter, and I'm really curious to know if they have another explanation for how the horse got lidocaine.
Well, there's one more point that you brought to my attention, which I found especially interesting. Gamine's 2020 positive for betamethasone in the Oaks. So
now, this was the Oaks that was run in September that year, right?
Yeah, the September Oaks, that one.
Several months after she tested positive for lidocaine, she tested positive at the Kentucky Oaks.
Yeah, and she ran third in that race, I believe. Right. So he insists that she had joint injections with betamethasone 18 days out from the race, and the recommended withdrawal guidelines are 14 days. However, the ALJ points out that Gamine got both hocks injected. whereas the Kentucky regulations and withdrawal guidelines are based on a single joint, not two joints. Now, it's completely typical to inject both hocks at the same time. That's very normal. But did they apparently not read the asterisk rules very well in that case? And if not, why not?
Another good question. I wish Bob was here to answer that one. Yeah, this is, it's kind of a never, it's, I thought the story was over, other
No,
than,
you're so funny.
yeah. So this administrative law judge recommendation came out in late May. And I think just before this came out, a judge in Kentucky in a civil lawsuit against Churchill Downs and its executives and board chairman. In that case, a judge granted summary judgment motion to Churchill Downs, essentially ending the lawsuit by Baffert against Churchill Downs, and that case could be appealed to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in Cincinnati. And in fact, Attorney Clark Brewster said it would be appealed when the original ruling came out. But I don't think an appeal has been filed, and I think they've decided to drop that. But I don't think they've dropped the actions against the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission. And my suspicion is that that's what's irritated Bill Carstanjen at Churchill Downs, is that they're still pushing or peddling, according to the press release, the narrative, and they called it a false narrative, that they did nothing wrong, that there was no reason for a suspension or disqualification of Medina Spirit.
I mean, why are we still fighting about this? It's not like the horse's stud career depends on this decision at this point. Baffert's already served his days. What even can possibly be the reason? It doesn't make any sense.
I think it's ego, and it's not just ego on one side of this argument. There's an ego on the other side too, and when two giant egos get involved in a war of words, it's like, stay out of the way. So,
or grab your bucket of popcorn and a lawn chair.
Yeah, that could be true too. Well, Chelsea, a couple of weeks ago, you wrote a story that got a lot of attention in some corners. It was a profile of trainer Steve Specht, Northern California horseman who had just won the Fasig-Tipton Debutante with a filly. And he had some things to say about the tightening of pre-race inspections and, how regulatory veterinarians somehow know more about a horse looking at it for 30 seconds than a trainer does, who basically lives with a horse 24 hours a day. Could you kind of comment a little bit on the reaction to that story? And
well, I was interested in his viewpoint because that is certainly something that I hear off the record from a great many trainers, is that the regulatory veterinarians don't know what they're doing. And obviously that is not something that I believe in any way, shape, or form. But I do understand that we are human beings and we can form biases and we can make mistakes. Not saying that any of that is done intentionally, of course. But wouldn't it be nice if we could take some of that arbitrariness out of these pre-race exams? In fact, I talked to Mr. Specht about this, and while he had not heard of the Stride Safe program that's been put in place at Churchill Downs and New York and Rayito Park in Arizona, he was intrigued by it and said, well, that would help solve this problem, would it not? It puts numbers and sort of not numbers yet, but it puts a system of screening in place over every horse that trains and races on that track to sort of say, hey, this horse maybe needs a little more veterinary attention. This horse is moving the same as it's always moved. This horse is moving a little differently. There are similar programs in place, or technologies in place, that put sensors on a horse while it's jogged up and down a road. Again, this technology is not perfect, but it could give us, if we were to invest in it, it could give us something to say, hey, here is a number with the science that says your horse should not race. or it says your horse needs to be looked at more closely. It needs another level of scrutiny. Can we please invest in something like this, please?
For the benefit of those who aren't familiar with StrideSafe, could you just take a second to explain how it works?
Sure. It's a sensor that sits in the horse's saddle towel, and it measures acceleration vectors, science words. It measures when the horse does this or when the horse does this. And is it making the same motion with every step? So it sends out like a pattern through the entire race of the horse, seeing, if it takes the bad step myth. If it takes a bad step, when does that happen? How does it affect the stride going forward? And it basically creates a pattern for each horse individually, as well as a pattern for the breed as a whole. And should the horse deviate either from its own pattern or the breed as a whole's pattern too much, then it will throw up a little flag. And it doesn't mean the horse is lame, or it doesn't mean that the horse is going to break down. It means, hey, this horse needs extra attention. Something's not quite right. Something has changed. We're noticing in science, in all these necropsies these days, that the fatalities that we're seeing often come from pre-existing injuries. And yet all of these horses are passing pre-race exams that we know are very, very stringent. So clearly there's something that we cannot see with the naked eye, that we need something more sensitive than the naked eye to be able to tell us. Hence science. Can we please have science? More science.
And when you say they had pre-existing injuries, these aren't necessarily injuries that could be detected. They could be microfractures.
Absolutely. It's a little bit of bone bruising, a little bit of just remodeling of the bone. It's Dr. Matthew Sprie in Southern California is doing fascinating work examining PET scans of fetlocks in racehorses, and showing that even the tiniest little mark on these PET scans that show where the bone reabsorption and laying down is changing too much can mean the difference between a horse that breaks down and a horse that doesn't.
Well, back to StrideSafe for a second. You're looking for a number. What they're doing is rating a horse's motion with a green, yellow, or red.
Sure, I would love a number. We're not at that stage yet scientifically.
Yeah.
A flag is better than nothing.
Yeah.
Let's use.
I'd say it's progress, and when I think back to just 15 years ago, when we were just getting started here at the Paulick Report, we just had our 15th anniversary, by the way, last couple of weeks ago. There was no equine injury database yet. There was work being done at the University of California, Davis. Necropsies are looking, studying horses that had suffered fatal injuries, but there was no really coordinated effort around the country. And if the one good thing that comes out of all of these spikes and fatalities is that we have a better system, then that's something we can look back on and say, well, at least it led us to a better place. The Santa Anita spikes, the Aqueduct spikes, and then this year at Churchill Downs. So, if we don't learn from these things, then we are doomed. And it looks like we are learning.
I also think this industry needs to be a little bit more open to learning from what we've done wrong, in terms of, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it isn't there. We need to understand how to read the data that we have. We need to work on improving that data. We need to invest in it, and we need to do everything in our power to make this a safer game for these animals. And this is the best way to go about it that I've ever seen.
Well, that's great. Chelsea, thanks so much for your thoughts on this. I got to have you on the Friday show more often.
No, it's okay. Once in a while is great. That gives me time to, build up some more opinions to share.
All right. Well, thanks to the Jockey Club for their sponsorship. Save the date, August 3rd. We've got the agenda on the Paulick Report website for the Jockey Club Roundtable. Always an exciting day to be in Saratoga Springs. It's Whitney Week. It's Hall of Fame Week. It's really a great time to be up there. I'll be in Del Mar, though. So that's going to do it for this week. We'll see you next week. Maybe we'll get Joe Neville's back next week on the Friday show. But otherwise, you're a good stand-in. Thanks, Chelsea. We'll see you next week.
Support award-winning independent horse industry journalism and become a Paulick Report Insider on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, insiders get access to exclusive Q&As with Paulick Report staff, insight behind our editorial process, exclusive opinions and on-site analysis, Paulick Report merch, and more. This is not a paywall. The website you know and love will always be the same. But if you want more, and you want to make our coverage even better, visit patreon.com/Paulick Report and become a Paulick Report Insider today.